In 2006, 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart was killed while house-sitting in Pocatello, Idaho. The investigation uncovered buried evidence and video recordings made by two of her classmates, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. In Part 1, we followed the investigation and the trial of Brian Draper, whose recorded statements, physical evidence, and actions after the crime led to his conviction for first-degree murder and conspiracy, and a life sentence in prison. This video continues the story, focusing on the separate trial of Tori Adamczyk and the question the second jury had to answer. Was he equally responsible for what happened that night? This video discusses a real homicide and legal proceedings involving minors tried as adults. Some material may be disturbing. The information presented is based on public court records, trial testimony, and documented reporting, and is shared for accuracy and respectful awareness. Viewer discretion is advised. Because Tori Adamczyk was tried separately, his case began again, in a different courtroom, with a different jury, but tied to the same night. A new jury was selected under the same legal standards used in Brian Draper's case. 12 jurors with no direct connection to the crime were tasked with deciding a narrower question. Did Tori Adamczyk knowingly share responsibility for Cassie's death under the law? Once the jury was sworn in, the trial began. From the start, the jury was presented with two competing interpretations of Adamczyk's role. The prosecution argued that this case was about participation, not association. According to the state, Adamczyk was present in recorded conversations about violence, returned to the house later that night, and was aware of efforts to conceal evidence afterward. Taken together, they argued those actions showed shared responsibility. The defense did not deny Adamczyk's presence or his voice on the recording. Instead, they questioned intent. Being part of conversations, they argued, is not the same as forming a plan, and not every person in a group carries the same level of responsibility. At the center of the defense's argument was influence. Adamczyk was 16 years old, and the defense asked whether his words and actions reflected deliberate planning, or a teenager reacting to peer dynamics without fully understanding the consequences. The question before the jury was simple. Did the evidence prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Tori Adamczyk intended to take part in a planned killing? This trial was not about proving who led. It was about whether Adamczyk knowingly stayed involved once the line into violence had been crossed. Under the law, the jury did not need to find that Adamczyk planned or led the crime, only that he knowingly agreed to it and remained involved once its nature was clear. The prosecution built its case around three connected points: the recordings, the timeline, and the knowledge after the crime. The jury heard Tori Adamczyk's voice on video recordings made before the murder. These were not police recordings and were not created after the fact. They were made voluntarily by the teenagers themselves. Unlike Brian Draper, Adamczyk did not make a single explicit statement advocating violence. There was no philosophical declaration and no direct admission of intent. The prosecution did not argue otherwise. Instead, they focused on context. Adamczyk was present in conversation about killing, speaking and responding alongside Draper, including moments where Cassie was referenced by name. He did not object, distance himself, or leave those discussions. The prosecution argued that conspiracy does not require the most extreme words, only knowing agreement and continued involvement once the plan becomes clear. The prosecution then focused on timeline. And this is where Adamczyk's case diverged from Draper's. Evidence showed Adamczyk had been at the house earlier in the evening, left, and later returned. Investigators reconstructed this sequence using interviews and corroborating information. According to the state, this return mattered because it came after the discussions on tape, turning Adamczyk's presence from passive association into an affirmative choice to reinsert himself into events already set in motion. Finally, the prosecution addressed what happened afterwards. Investigators recovered buried evidence from a remote location outside town: clothing, masks, weapons that had been deliberately concealed. Draper led investigators to the site. The prosecution did not claim Adamczyk did. Instead, they focused on knowledge. Testimony showed Adamczyk was aware that the items had been hidden and understood what had been done with them. According to the state, concealment requires awareness, and awareness suggests involvement. Taken together, the prosecution asked the jury to see a progression: participation in discussions before the crime, a decision to return to the house that night, and awareness of efforts to hide evidence afterward. Not isolated facts, but continued involvement. The state's position was clear. Adamczyk did not merely follow events as they unfolded, he knowingly remained involved from discussion to continued presence that night to concealment. Enough, they argued, to establish shared responsibility under the law. The defense did not deny the recordings, Adamczyk's presence, or the seriousness of what happened. They challenged what the evidence meant. An adolescent development expert testified that at 16, the brain's areas responsible for impulse control and long-term planning are still developing. Teenagers, he explained, are more susceptible to peer influence and may engage in exaggerated or performative speech in group settings. The defense emphasized a key point: teenagers can talk about extreme ideas without fully grasping their permanence. Applied to the recordings, the defense asked whether Adamczyk's participation reflected a deliberate plan or a reaction shaped by influence and bravado rather than intent. They also called one person who knew Adamczyk before the crime. She described him as quiet, uncertain, and more likely to follow than lead. She did not claim to know what he did that night. Her testimony served a narrow purpose: to show that Adamczyk was not typically someone who initiated or dominated decisions. The prosecution countered that knowing someone in everyday life does not predict private choices. The defense did not dispute that. Their point remained focused. The evidence showed presence. But did it prove intent? In closing, the prosecution returned to the same pattern: discussion, continued involvement at night, and concealment, all pointing, they argued, to shared intent. One line captured their position: words followed by actions are not just talk, they are proof of intent. The defense focused on intent rather than presence, asking whether a 16-year-old speaking in a peer setting truly understood what was being discussed. Their question was direct. The law does not ask whether he was there, it asks whether he deliberately planned. After brief rebuttal, the jury was left to decide whether continued involvement amounted to criminal intent. The jury found Tori Adamczyk guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. At sentencing, Cassie's family spoke about who she had been and the absence left behind. The defense asked the court to consider Adamczyk's age and potential for change. The judge acknowledged his youth, but emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the degree of planning involved. The court concluded that the gravity of the offense overweighed mitigating factors. Tori Adamczyk was sentenced to life in prison. After the trials, life in Pocatello resumed, but altered. The case shattered assumptions about safety and familiarity. Schools brought in counselors, parents became more cautious, teenagers became more aware that danger does not always arrive as a stranger. As the case gained national attention, its details were retold repeatedly. For outsiders, it became a disturbing crime story. For those inside the community, each retelling reopened something that never fully closed. The case permanently changed how trust and safety were understood. Both convictions remained in place. Later Supreme Court rulings require juvenile life sentences to include the possibility of future review. While the convictions were not overturned, the legal definition of life for crimes committed at 16 changed, allowing parole consideration after decades of incarceration. Before courtrooms and verdicts, Cassie Jo Stoddart was simply a teenager living an ordinary life. She was 16, old enough to have plans, young enough that most were still taking shape. Friends remembered her as kind and dependable, someone people felt comfortable around. Those details never appeared on evidence lists, but they mattered more than anything said in court. After her death, Cassie became known publicly through the worst moment of her life. For those who loved her, memory became the way she remained. Stories shared quietly, photos held onto, a name spoken with love and ache at the same time. The legal system answers its questions. It imposes consequences, but no sentence could return what was taken. Not just a life, but a future still unfolding. Cassie was not a case study. She was not a lesson. She was a person whose life mattered long before tragedy ever touched it. Letting that be the final note is how this story should be held. Thank you for listening with care and respect.